My name is Ivan Rusin. I'm a member of the committee, and I'll be chairing the next panel discussion, but I think it's very good that we have a bridge between this panel discussion and the next one, which will be more on how one can start or begin using new science in some of the decision-making and context of different government agencies. And Dr. Ashford already was introduced, so I'll waste no time, but we're looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Do we have a new battery here now? Let's see. Can you see this? Yeah. Before I embark on the specific talk for which I was asked to prepare, let me ask you to do a thought experiment. Suppose there were 10 Apple computers along that front table, and I were to open the motherboards of all those computers, and I were to take these little Scotty magnets that your kids play with, and I had 10 pairs of the magnets, and I threw them into the motherboard of all 10 computers, and then closed the computer, and asked the first computer to add 2 and 2, and it gives me -5. And then I asked the second computer, how much is 2 and 2? And it says 1/3. The third one just whirs. The fourth one doesn't do anything. Now, if we had computer epidemiologists, they would look at these 10 computers and they'd say, they obviously have a different disease. If they didn't see me throw the Scotty magnets into the computer, they would say these are certainly different diseases. Not only that, but the incidence of the malfunction, the inability to add 2 and 2, would not be significant enough to say there was any disease in the population at all. That's what we've got with brain-mediated, brain-damaged disease. And I would argue that there is one of the bases for the toxicant-induced loss of tolerance is a brain-mediated damage, which when you throw a neurotoxic, especially chemical, into the brain, and you know a lot of them get to the brain, the limbic system, which is where the immune system, the nervous system, and the endocrine system cross, may misbehave in a number of ways. One of the ways in which it may misbehave may be that you have endocrine disruption. Another way that it may misbehave is that you have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. A third way in which it may misbehave may be that you have autism. Now, I said it was a thought experiment, right? But in fact, probably the organ that we know the least about and which is computer central to our entire existence is our brains. And I would argue that was what Claudia was talking about yesterday. Is that there should be a label on the vertical axis here. Nope, go back. Yeah, you probably can't move it over. But it has to do with the number of people exhibiting a certain sensitivity versus the dose. Now, we have been operating under the assumption that there is a classic Gaussian distribution, curve A, and that actually it's not so simple, that what contributes, especially at the low end of that sensitivity, is some genetic modification of the subject or some nutritional deficit. And we heard a lot about that. But there are, as Dr. Schwartz yesterday indicated, there are entirely different pathways to disease which are not connected with that Gaussian distribution. So classically, we know, for example, that allergy, atopy, is not a classic. And there's a totally separate distribution, very often far removed in exposure size from the classical size. And then there's cancer, right, which is a two-step process also. At least initiation, probably followed by promotion, where once you've initiated, the promotion occurs. And I want to point out, for example, that our well-known formaldehyde, right, as a chemical, has carcinogenic, systemic, classical toxic, and sensitizing properties. You would draw a different sensitivity curve for those three effects just from formaldehyde. And let me suggest that what we're dealing with is not just the variations that make up the Gaussian distribution. And by the way, you take identically bred mice, you don't get a point estimate for the effect. You have a distribution because what looks like uniformly bred animals have their natural variations. So I want you to keep in mind that there is this problem, and the toxic-induced loss of tolerance says that there's a chemical that maybe people are exposed to which results in a loss of tolerance. That is, the endocrine system, the immune system, or the nervous system may be affected such that a subsequent exposure ends up having differential effects. Sometimes they affect the nervous system, sometimes they affect the immune system. We really firmly believe that the variety of things which are separated as different diseases, like endocrine disruption and ADHD, actually may have their origin in a classical neurotoxic attack of a chemical on the brain, followed by non-classical responses, because most people's brains, in fact, are not affected. Now, I just offer that because it's an additional complication. Now, I've come to talk about alternatives. It is, what does all this science mean for how we should adopt our approach to chemical control? In any construction of a regulatory framework, boy, this is not off. Is this off-center on yours or just mine? Oh, it's not. You're fine. Okay, you have to ask questions of whether, where, when, how, and to what extent to intervene. That is, there has to be a rational process in order to decide what to do, right? You could notify those that are affected. You could regulate exposure. You could eliminate or ban the material. Or you could treat those that are impacted, or all else failing, you can compensate those for harm. If you give massive vaccinations, you want everybody to receive the vaccinations, but you understand that there may be a small percentage that may be adversely affected. And what are the criteria for deciding? Well, you ask the question, what strength of evidence triggers a requirement for what action? That is, when do you have enough science to tell people maybe you ought to avoid this substance? When do you have enough science to regulate exposure? And when do you have enough science to ban the substance completely? And usually this follows a sequential model of doing risk assessment, followed by the risk management. This is the paradigm that's followed. And what I want to say today is that that particular paradigm no longer can easily be used when the things we've been talking about for 2 days are taken into account, because risk assessment has become very complicated. And, at some point, you have to ask the question, shall we spend our resources clarifying risk and alternative pathways to disease? Or should we say, look, this chemical is not essential. There are easy substitutes. Some are non-chemical substitutes. Maybe we ought to move to the back of an envelope and ask whether there are clearly better substitutes, or this chemical is not essential, rather than to get mired down into the interesting but really hopeless task of characterizing risk completely. I mean, we're at a point where we have very little resources in that sense. And we talk about the kinds of uncertainty, and there are three different kinds of uncertainty. One is classical uncertainty, where a little bit of research will clarify. We know what we need to know. The other is where we don't know what we need to know. And then, of course, there is the area where we don't know what we don't know. It makes it very, very difficult. And we have fine examples of these. And the question for this group here is, how does interindividual variability affect our approach to this problem? it is different to talk about clarifying the Gaussian distribution and what's on the highly sensitive end from dealing with pathways to disease, which are entirely different. I mean, we heard during this meeting that there are 3 different kinds of asthma. They're not all the same. They end up in people wheezing, but it's not the same disease. And so we need to really be careful about how we put the costs and the benefits of an intervention into perspective. So what are important considerations relevant to decisions about what we should do about chemical control? Well, the seriousness and irreversibility of the harm, the difficulties in assessing risk comprehensively. And I say, for example, climate disruption is still a subject. How bad it's going to be, whether the Gulf Stream is going to be diverted sufficiently to plunge Europe into the Ice Age. Those are questions. We know what we don't know. Genetic modification, large interindividual variability. This is very interesting. And I would argue that the purpose of doing the research on interindividual variability is not so that we make a more precise guess about what a safe level is, but that we explain to the decision makers that maybe we've reached a point where we really ought to go to a safer technology. And the whole concept of green chemistry, which is being pursued in California and other places, is an approach which says, look, enough already. It's complex enough that we cannot make these decisions on the basis of risk assessment. There are legal mandates, as I mentioned yesterday, to protect susceptible populations or groups. And who is affected makes a difference. But so are the technological options for preventing or arresting or reversing or mitigating problems in public health and environment from exposures. And society has an inclination about what it wants to be right or wrong about. And one you know about, that is, do we want to commit type 1 or type 2 errors in terms of either not regulating enough or regulating too much with the economic burden, but there's also an inclination with regard to whether or not we want to promote the development of new technology that doesn't have these problems. Now, in 1970, our structure-activity relationships for classical toxicity wasn't very good. We didn't predict the toxicity of vinyl chloride. We didn't predict the toxicity of asbestos. But in 2012, structure-activity relationships tell us a lot, not with regard to everything. Perhaps endocrine disruption is not yet ripe for a SARS approach. But the European Union, in its REACH initiative, favors using SARS as opposed to animal experimentation because it's sufficiently developed to adopt a posture which says, look, if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck and it sings like a duck, maybe we should assume it's a duck because there are alternatives, right, which we ought to adopt. Now, there are different kinds of information. There's scientific information. You know what that is. It's product ingredients, it's toxicity and safety hazards, exposure to harmful substances, risk characterization from those, but then also interindividual variability. Are we emerging on a time where we're going to delay controlling chemicals which are clear problems because we haven't fully characterized them from an interindividual variability? That's the danger. It used to be mechanisms of action that used to delay the regulatory process. Now, it's not just scientific information, but technological information is important. What are the existing options for moving away from the use of a chemical or exposure? And what kinds of chemicals could be developed? You know, it takes you $5 million to do an animal feeding study. You give me $5 million, I will redesign 20 industrial processes. You think about that. I mean, we are putting our resources in areas which I understand many of you are really intrigued by and have dedicated your professional life, but you ought to use those skills and those resources to demonstrate the generality of the results, not to decide to fill in the missing elements so we can take the 65,000 chemicals on the inventory and characterize them. By the way, I don't believe that 65,000 chemicals cause problems. As a chemist, I think someplace between 1,200 and 1,800 chemicals are really the major problem in terms of health and environmental effect. But of course, they have enormous economic value and enormous promoters. But if less than 2,000 chemicals, we could begin to seriously look at substitutes and non-chemical alternatives, we would all be out of a job in 20 years. And that would be a good thing to do. I mean, 20 years is long enough. Beat a dead horse, right? Okay. How do you decide what level of exposure to control? Well, whoops, go back on this. How do I get to the slide previous? Previous to that. Okay. If you take the cost of control versus the risk, and you look at the curve, which is downward sloping, this curve is generated by the cost of the technology or to control a particular chemical. And as the risk becomes less and less, it becomes increasingly expensive to control. Now, if you're an economist, you will look at the upward sloping curve, which is the demand for risk reduction. We mentioned that yesterday. And you do where the marginal costs and the marginal benefits are equal. That's the economically equilibrium point. But there are other ways to decide how to control risk. You could simply look at the risk and say, well, I don't think anybody ought to have an exposure above that level. Or you could look at the cost curve and say, well, it looks at the point called diminishing returns. It's becoming very expensive to lower the risk compared to what it did previously. Or you go to the end of the line, or you could adopt the Clean Air Act for hazardous substances approach, take the average of the top 13%. That's using existing technology. If you note that not only is there existing technology, but there are curves called new technology, which are much lower. The new technology curves are much lower in cost to control or find substitutes. I'll remind you that the OTA, before it's closed its doors, wrote a report that looked at the pre-regulatory assessment of the cost of controlling workplace hazards compared to the post-regulatory cost. And in a number of cases, the cost of control turned out to be 1/3 to 1/5 of the pre-regulatory assessments. Technological innovation gives you significant changes in the cost. And if you just take the existing technology curve and see where it crosses the demand curve, then yes, you're going to find that's the level of risk that should be controlled and that cost. This is what OMB would like us to do. Or a new technology curve which lies lower. And by the way, we have 30 years of empirical data of how stringent regulation always develops a technology which is cheaper and better. But you have to have the stringent regulation. And even if you believe in being cost conscious, for the same cost as it used to control a chemical at the old technology, the new technology, which is the green dot, you get much lower costs at the same risk. Or you could spend the same amount of money and get a much lower risk, that's the black dot. Or even if you believed in equilibrium solutions, you get that second green dot. And that triangle made by the dots is called a win-win situation. That is, I understand that risk assessors and biological scientists don't concern themselves with the cost of technology, but the decision makers do. And the point is that you have choices here. The precautionary principle, which is only mentioned a few times here, involves avoiding costs having to do with not regulating sufficiently or regulating too much, but it also asks whether we're asking the wrong problem. Are we pursuing an explication of risk at the cost of finding easy solutions? And we could commit a different kind of error. We could fail to hold industry's feet to the fire to develop or employ better technology. You know, the technology very often is already out there. It's just not being used. And the point is that for cost or other reasons. But I think we need to have a shift from a risk-driven policy towards a technology-driven policy. The traditional approach, risk management, is sequential. It involves collecting risk information, performing a detailed risk assessment, and shall I say, including interindividual variability, undertaking risk management measures based on the existing solutions. There's another approach, and that is recognizing that an overly comprehensive and protracted risk assessment postpones the date by which we actually do something about a problem. And a more synchronized process is needed, one in which we look at the technological alternatives which either exist or could be developed and decide we're going to move away from using phthalates in children's toys, for example. This chemical by chemical approach, standard by standard approach, cannot possibly address the expansion of the realization of the problems. As we look at the science, not only do we realize that interindividual variability complicates the matter, but if you recall lead and you recall asbestos, you realize that and formaldehyde, levels we once thought were safe turn out to be not safe. We keep ratcheting what a safe level means to me. And I think research which shows that interindividual variability complicates the issue such that we really need to switch our approach is really what's needed. I won't go into these scenarios, but it turns out, and it's in the paper that I've listed, but it turns out that it always makes sense to ask whether you should study a problem in detail from the risk perspective as opposed to how difficult it would be to eliminate that particular substance. You have the example of CFCs that was made by DuPont and which destroyed the ozone layer, and we ultimately developed substitutes beyond what DuPont was offering us, which were neither flammable nor destructive of the ozone layer. Technology has enormous capabilities. We just need to put it to work. And we have to have a holistic view of where we're going on what has been a risk-driven process to change it towards a solution-driven process. So let me stop there because I think time is short and maybe there's even some time for some questions. Well, yeah, but that's, I think, the third slide is where you really, everything is uncertain. Everything is uncertain. And so rather than embarking from the ground up of characterizing risk, that we really need to think seriously about what we do when the risk side continues to evade us. That is when it's relatively uncertain. I respect scientific research. I just think it needs to be done selectively where there are large lessons to be learned and to demonstrate principles of why it's important to go to solutions rather than to continue the sequential process which was offered to us by Ruckelshaus 30 years ago, right?
We have 6 people standing, so I'd appreciate if you guys can have short questions so we can go to the break and then continue this discussion in the panel. So.
John Bablis with NIEHS. I appreciate a very nice, wide-ranging conversation. your conclusion about looking at a solution space rather than the risk space is very consistent with the recent NRC report on risk assessment. We dealt with that a lot and ultimately came out in that level. At the same time, you put a lot of emphasis on the cost benefit curve graph and the fact that technology often advances to lower the cost for a given amount of risk reduction. But one of the things that I've brought to this group over the years is that there's a discrepancy between the precision with which in an information poor environment we can put a dollar figure on the cost compared to how well we can really demonstrate what the benefit is. And we generally are not very accurate. There's a lot of uncertainty, and we often underestimate the benefits just as we overestimate the costs.
Yes.
So we don't have a point there.
No.
So we have a space. And so my question to you is, how do we actually motivate the expenditure on technology advancement without doing the work of articulating the benefits of reducing the exposures?
Yeah, and here I break with Mr. Sunstein, who went to the law school I went to years ago. You don't calculate where you should be. I'm just simply demonstrating that using static technology is certainly likely to get you suboptimal on both the cost and the risk. We ought to decide levels of protection or banning harmful chemicals on the basis of the level of risk protection we want to deliver. It ought to be health motivated, because the technology, let me assure you, will come along with benefits to the society. Now, when Monsanto was prohibited from making PCBs, it lost its entire PCB market to Dow Silicone. I'm not saying there aren't winners and losers, but what you don't want is the public health community and the population to be the losers. I mean, you have a turnover of technology. That's what innovation is about. And I understand that the stockholders of Monsanto aren't going to be happy with my comments. But the point is, you cannot hold hostage the public health and environment to specific environmental interests. You can't do it in the energy market. You can't do it in the petroleum market. You can't do it in the public health market. I do not mean, but Sunstein does, that I actually am going to calculate where we should regulate on the basis of where the two technologies is going to be. And you're absolutely right. Measuring the value of a human life or a cancer case prevented isn't anything anybody's ever going to agree with, except the economists in OMB. And then they never saw a regulation they liked.
Cheryl Walker, Institute for Biosciences and Technology. So first of all, thank you for that very fresh and obviously passionate talk. So I have a comment and then a question. So I was particularly interested in your point about substitutes. And what resonated with that is thinking about two examples that we know of, one of which is asbestos and one of which is actually BPA. So the interesting thing about substituting for asbestos was that once the ceramic fibers started getting looked at more closely, suddenly with aspect ratio, length and things, they could find exactly the same things that they were seeing with asbestos. So in the absence of mechanism, that was a very dubious type of substitution. It was sort of the best thing at the time, but this point of absence of mechanism is going to come back. BPA is the same thing. Mike Mancini from Baylor recently presented at an NIEHS meeting that looking at 19 BPA analogs in commercial production that could be used as substitutes. In fact, if you look mechanistically, some of those were far worse than the parent compound.
Use a glass bottle.
Yeah. So, but my question, I'm not trying to be facetious. My question is, what are your thoughts? And you must have thought about how mechanism might inform technology in terms of substituting for things that are doing harm.
Those are very good questions. Look, fibers are fibers, and we know the problem with substituting even calcium carbonate fibers for asbestos. You've got to think comprehensively. It just isn't toluene for benzene. It isn't just, I mean, you've got to think non-chemical solutions. It's not just chemical solutions. And the fact there's an absence of characterization of the substitute should not give you carte blanche to use that substitute. I mean, we have a good sense, don't we, that using a glass bottle is different than using any kind of a can with any kind of a plastic interior. Now, tin can people aren't going to like that answer. But those are the kinds of significant technological changes you have. When you don't know whether you can eliminate a possible similar mechanism, err on the side of demanding the technology which is much more certain to be safe. Now, could we ever be wrong with that approach? The answer is of course. But looking at the whole regulatory area from a portfolio perspective, we are much less likely to be wrong in selecting safer substitutes than we are the approach that we're taking, because we have so many of the chemicals are uncharacterized. I hope that answers your
Thank you.
Your question. Yeah.
I think my question follows up on your very last statement there, Nick. I mean, we have, in my view, our policies are oriented toward not acting in the face of uncertainty, and you've made a good case for why the greater and greater complexity that is being dumped into risk assessment is going to increase, likely not decrease, uncertainty, right. And that paralyzing effect that our policies reflect. But can you talk a little bit about how uncertainty in the context of your paradigm shift would in fact play out? That, in other words, on what basis did you just say that the uncertainty associated with technological options and their likely costs and benefits, how did you arrive at the concept that that uncertainty is less than it would be in a risk assessment driven policy decision making context?
Well, there's uncertainty with regard to risk, and then there's uncertainty with regard to the adequacy of the new technology coming to performance. Do you mean the latter question, or do you mean the former? Because you can eliminate the uncertainty in the case that was brought. You don't use a can with any kind of a lining. Use glass. I mean, you know.
But as you know, the whole concept of looking at alternatives has a whole set of complications as well. What's the scope of the assessment? How do you deal with trade-offs? How do you project where the cost or the benefits of the technology will go with certain drivers? And I thought you had said at the end there that the uncertainties associated with those kinds of policy drivers
right.
would be less.
They would be much less because, Richard, we know what is inherently safe. I mean, this is not 1970 where we couldn't anticipate asbestos, where we couldn't anticipate vinyl chloride. We know that using certain non-chemical approaches or chemical approaches where we've got a clear history that there isn't a problem with that particular technology, we're much more likely to identify the existing substitute technology or ones that would demand to be developed. And you could specify that a technology does not have X, Y, or Z, and then give industry enough time to use its good brains to develop it. And the history of stringent regulation in this country from 1970 to date has shown when you regulate stringently, you get amazingly better technology. So could I be wrong in an instant case? Absolutely. Am I likely to be wrong from a portfolio perspective? Hell no.
Bill Farland, Colorado State University. Nick, I want to go back to the last panel and the discussion that we had about, who is a trusted group with regard to making these kinds of decisions. Because I think while I completely agree with the idea of bringing innovation into this and not continuing to sort of beat on the issues of things that we know are hard in order to be able to characterize uncertainty around them, the use of innovation is still going to require the scientific community to weigh in terms of safety issues. And so how do you see the trust issue with regard to the former versus the latter? Are we going to be able to be a trusted asset to the community if we take this alternative approach?
Well, let me say something really nasty. The chemical industry is probably not involved in development of non-chemical technology. So, for all the influence they have, and I, at one time in my life, worked for Monsanto and for Shell. Okay, so I want to tell you I've seen the beast from the inside. People can make mistakes, But when people are working on ideas about inherent safety, environmentally inherently better ways to approach things, we pretty well know today what not to do and what to do. We pretty well know those things. We're not going to be surprised. Now, if you're just looking for off-the-shelf substitution for existing chemicals, I would be really wary of that, for the reason that the example came up before in terms of fibers. But a short answer to the question is you want to make sure that the technologists that advise do not have any kind of hidden agenda or hidden economic connection with people who would benefit from that. Let me tell you a story really quick. I did work in automobiles before I did work in chemicals. And we noticed in 1970 that the foreign automobile industry had penetrated the U.S. automobile market by 25%. Toyota, Volkswagen, and Volvo. And what the domestic Detroit manufacturers were saying, we cannot comply, we can't make these fuel emission requirement goals and so forth. The foreign automobile companies were developing and putting on technology which they were bringing into this country, and they penetrated the market. Now, I went to Joan Claybrook and I went to Doug Kossel and I said, give me some money at MIT, we'll go to Japan, we'll go to Sweden, we'll go to Germany and find out what motivated the development of the new technology. And what we went is what the domestics here viewed as market constraints, the foreign companies viewed as opportunities for market penetration. But here's the story. Whose patents do you think Volvo and Toyota and Volkswagen put on their cars? U.S. patents, which were not applied by Detroit. And then Joan Claybrook said to me, a related question, Bill, how do I know how far I can push Detroit? Because, theoretically, I could push them when they wouldn't be able to make the standards. And I said, you hire yourself a retired Volvo engineer, a retired Toyota engineer, and a retired Volkswagen engineer, the best ones you can find. You bring them, they're already out of the company. They know what Detroit can do. And I would tell you that there are plenty of technologists that know how to develop safer technology. Not everyone. Not everybody who studies material sciences knows anything about toxicology. But there I refer to the fragmentation of the knowledge base. If we don't widely educate people, we're not going to have people who do this. I hope that answers in some way your important question.
I would greatly appreciate, really brief questions.
This is going to be a really brief comment. Rita Shoney, U.S. EPA, currently with Office of Research and Development, but the last 15 years I've been working in the Office of Water, and I hope the comment is apropos to the panel this morning and to your discussion right now, Doctor, which is the Office of Water has been moving as quickly as feasible in the Fed to go away from chemical by chemical regulation and rather to regulate groups of chemicals that can be either monitored in with one monitoring technique or removed or prevented from getting into the water with one available technology. And we have two regulations in the pipeline right now that in a perfect world, everyone is going to love. But under the Safe Drinking Water Act, we are still obliged, before we can issue a national regulation, to demonstrate that there is a meaningful opportunity to reduce public health impairment or to reduce risk. So it still has to be done under the law. We will continue to have to apply risk assessment technologies. And I dearly hope that they will be appropriate demonstrations of reduction of risk given these particular technologies that we're going to apply. That's all I'm going to say about that one. We'll probably talk about it more later this morning.
Let's take that as a comment.
Let me just make a comment, and that is, we also have the Pollution Prevention Act. And the Pollution Prevention Act, 1996, mandates that the administrator look at all the existing line-driven regulations to see if the preferred pollution prevention cleaner technology ought to suggest a redrafting of those regulations. No one's ever imposed that requirement. And the Pollution Prevention Act, along with TSCA, are the two underutilized pieces of legislation that EPA has. You have not shifted, and I love EPA. You've not shifted to a pollution prevention approach in the line offices. You need to look at the Pollution Prevention Act and kick the administrator in the butt.
Stephen McFadden, Independent Scientific Research Advocates. I'm a child of the Manhattan Project, Westinghouse Science Talent Search finalist, and graduate of Teller Tech. Some of us have been at this game for over 2 decades. I think, Nick, you were probably at the NAS meeting in '91 in California, and I was at the Persian Gulf Experience in Health. If we don't solve this problem with respect to disabled people now, it won't be solved in our lifetime. Secondary victimization was when the society's response to a disability is more victimizing than the disability itself. By '96, with EPA headquarters case and 2 other cases, it was apparent that there was a problem. For instance, there are people who need 100% telecommute positions. If you can't deal with an employer on that, you aren't going to get it anywhere. And it's, they say the fastest way up in society is education. The fastest way down is in ill health. With respect to zoning, for instance, the gold standard is the Environmental Control Unit. People with chemical sensitivities need porcelain trailers. But what disabled person can fight their local zoning board? It's victimizing. With benefits, Social Security is still redlining chemical injury cases. When someone is redlined from Social Security, that's about a $300,000 loss to their family.
Sorry, do you have a question?
I'm pointing out that if we don't solve this problem now, it won't be solved in our lifetime.
I appreciate the comment.
Yeah, regulatory agencies are interested in preventing people from getting sick, not tending to those that are already suffering. I mean, it's just the way it is. The Access Board and compensation agencies are different. But, I mean, I believe that a lot of future generations of disabled people could be prevented if we started to seriously think about the different pathways that need to be controlled. Of course, having a large number of disabled people is a way of drawing attention to the fact that a problem needs to be solved. And that, whether it's breast cancer or it's chemical sensitivity, that serves that purpose. And, sadly, a lot of people are suffering from a lot of things, including economic demise, that this country is not addressing.
Thank you very much. Let's thank Nick, and let's